Welcome, welcome. Maybe let's give people a couple minutes. Looks like they're trickling in. I don't want it to be too quiet. So maybe I'll go ahead and get us started. And I think while we make introductions, folks can trickle in. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. My name is Matam Shifarao, and I'm a poetry faculty at Pacific University. I'm here on behalf of our program director, Scott Korb, who couldn't make it today. And I'm happy to introduce this event, and I'll introduce Shompole, who will be facilitating the panel. The second season of the Pacific University MFA Mapmakers Alumni Institute continues our engagement and support of Mapmakers Scholars who have graduated from the program to help bring their work to the world. The Mapmakers Scholarship Fund is named after Mapmaker, an early collection of poems by MFA faculty member Kwame Dawes. Dawes has been a leader in the program's mission to diversify the writers we serve and create equity. In helping us name the scholarship, he said, "The title characterizes what I think of myself as both a writer and as an advocate for the work of others, and as someone who tries to open new territories for those who have not had access." First offered in January 2018, the scholarship is awarded to exceptional students of color like Shompole. I'll introduce our facilitator today, and she'll take it from there. And El Shompole, who's our Star Mapmaker alumni for 2022. Her written and photographic works have appeared in various print and online publications, including the 2020 anthology, Alone Together, Love, Grief, and Comfort in Time of COVID-19, Rust plus Moth, Words Dance publication, the Rising Phoenix Review, and the Joyce Gordon Gallery. Her most recent work includes the UG Award-nominated African sci-fi short story Strangers Tomorrow, which was published in the 2019 anthology Disconnected. I've had the unique pleasure of working with Shompole, and I simply love her work. And it's mythical, folkloric, so imaginative, reminding us of the traditions that have made us and reshaping them at the same time through such innovative storytelling. So welcome everyone, and thank you for being here. And thank you, Shompole, for bringing this wonderful group of writers together.
Thank you. Thank you, Matam, for that wonderful introduction. And we have Cal, who I also like to thank. He's in the background, just making sure everything runs as it should. I would like to introduce three amazing writers that I'm very excited to speak with tonight and hear more about their work for this panel, which is the Folklore Revisited panel. And essentially, why I put this panel together was just to ask questions and discuss things like why we tell stories, which stories do we tell, which ones do we keep, and which ones do we leave behind. Tonight we have Badji, Su-Yee Lin, and Rosa Alcalá. And I'll begin with a quick introduction of the writers, and then we will jump into readings. So we'll have Badji going first, and then we'll have Su-Yee Lin, and we'll close out with Rosa Alcalá, and then I'll do a short reading of my own work. I'll read 4 poems and why I'm interested in folklore, and then we'll open it up for the discussion and questions. So I'll just jump right into the introductions. Baba Badji is a Senegalese American storyteller, poet, translator, and researcher. He earned his PhD in comparative literature at Washington University in St. Louis and MFA in poetry and translation at Columbia University. Badji is a fellow at the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice and a postdoctoral fellow in comparative literature at Rutgers University. His research and teachings interests center on the links between various forms of post-colonial studies, theory, and practice, with a particular focus on debates about post-colonial translation theory and practice and negritude in Anglophone and Francophone cultures. Besides English and French, he's fluent in Wolof, Manding, and Diola, and he calls on these languages in his writing that informed both his creative and scholarly work. Baba will read from his book of poems, Ghost Letters, which was recently longlisted for the 2021 National Book Award for Poetry. Su-Yee Lin is a writer from New York with degrees from Brown University and the MFA program at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, a 2012 Fulbright Fellow to China and a 2014 Center for Fiction Fellow. She's also been the recipient of the grants and residencies from Gentel, Queen's Council on the Arts, Writers Omni, Seoul Art Space, and Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, among others. Her writing has appeared in Day One, The Offing, Electric Literature, Nashville Review, Tor.com, Interfictions, and elsewhere. Her story, A Flock, a Siege, a Murmuration, published by Bennington Review, won a Pushcart Prize. Rosa Alcalá is the author of 3 books of poetry, most recently My Other Tongue from Future Poem, 2017. Her poems appear in numerous anthologies, including Best American Poetry, 2019, American Poets in the 21st Century, Poetics of Social Engagement, The Nation, and American Poetry Review. The recipient of a National Endowment for the Arts Translation Fellowship and a runner for the PEN Translation Award, she's the editor and co-translator of New and Selected Poems of Cecilia Vicuna from Kelsey Street Press in 2018. She is the professor of creative writing at the University of Texas at El Paso, where she teaches in bilingual MFA program. It's bilingual MFA program. So when I was reaching out to these writers, I had come across their work over the years. And there were just, when I was thinking about this panel, when I spoke to Scott Korb, who's the director of the program, about what I could do, their work, as I was looking at the writers I would love to talk to, their work kind of just jumped out, both for what it is, but also in how it kind of engages with the same topics I'm trying to engage in, and in very different ways. And I thought that was really what was fascinating about bringing them all together. They have different backgrounds, they're approaching folklore and poetry and fiction in different ways, but it's all tied in with these idea of like folklore, mythology, fairy tales, which I all include for the sake of this conversation under the term folklore. So with all that said, we will begin with Baba Badji, and then, yeah, let's move on.
Thank you, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Rosa. It's an honor to be here. I know your work, not personally, but I know you on the page, and it's really moving to be here with you today. Sue, thank you for being here, and thank you, everyone. Shompole, thank you so much. So I'll read from Ghost Letters. I'll read the last poem of the book. And also thank you to all the organizers and those who are here, because Scott was not able to make it. So thank you for making the time. This poem, it's called Dear Mama. It is said you nurture dusk and the holy desert, alhamdulillah. It is said you bless me with vultures and hyenas, alhamdulillah. It is said that you nurture cassava garden and mud, alhamdulillah. You said we do not deceive, dying, even restrain at high sea. Mama, you said dying like a ghost. It was restrained for the blessed crowd to witness, the raven and the vulture, the camel and the donkey, fairness, and harmony in our village, at the mosque, in church. It is said you nurture hyena bones, alhamdulillah. It is said you nurture Senegalese owls on their journey at night. Don't tell them founding fathers, detail of black feathers in the middle of jungles. Milkman said, vultures and his client do not go to prison. Milkman said his son, Yara, will not beat his case because vultures came for food and red meat. Everyone desired absence. Uncle Omar Muhammad Sheikh said, Alhamdulillah, you are linking to the universal. Can you imagine Officer X protecting Kampo and Kankuran Bilai Walla? Can you imagine Officer X protecting Yara? Ghost's mother said, Judge, my boy, he did not do it, even if a price on our heads. It is said it was important for Yara's case when he asked where was his judge. Each body still throbbing, broken to black and dying tolerantly. Coffin maker said, Inshallah, hyena, vultures, owls, and his client will never do a double homicide. The unknown for the end of hunger. Shrine keeper said, don't tell them founding fathers how we nurture vultures, how we care for mud and hunger. You said, even restrain alive and dying a black death. You said, we are not born in the USA. You said, we come to the USA. You said, we become the USA. You said, we are the USA. You said, Judge, my boy, he did not do it. A scene, vultures in mud, a dream, nurses and their hunger, restrained alive and dying a black death, Americanized for violence. Of course, we learn it in the Atlantic, vultures in the abattoir, decomposing our dreams, history and milk about a woman, a black woman from a lover, dust in the holy desert, blood hung in flowers, only in destroyed cities. About a French woman, Ghost's mother said, it is Passover. We have wine and matzah, sacred ghosts in the synagogue, drunk from honey. We wait for coffin maker and the rabbi to bless us. The rabbi came with challah bread. Ghost's mother gone. We lit candles to read our wounds. The rabbi came during Rosh Hashanah to bless us from the dream. We hunger ourselves in the marais. The rabbi came to hunger with us before he entered Place des Vosges. After prayer hour, hunger ripens in America, but the rabbi blessed us. His work is the holiest. He gave me ghosts and a hunter's gift. My God, the rabbi's gift, watching over us. He cursed American violence. The evening he came to light the menorah with us. Prayers rabbi gave to us. Rabbi came bearing gifts, latke, sour cream, and applesauce from the Holy Land. Rethinking Rosh Hashanah and Hanukkah through the rabbi is a blessing. My limbs swung inside my dark skin. Ghost mother stooped at the door to pray for my holy body to return home safely. Ghost mama kneeled near Jesus to beg for my safe return. Ghost mama was pleading to the judge when her tears and her sweaty hands sealed a Jesus cross. Ghost mama said, American violence is learned violence. It is the American way. Jesus' milk is dripped for my departure. My arrival would be a beginning. My arrival is a beginning. I came with blessing, mud, black blood, gracious as a slave. You said, Surah Al-Fatiha, never, never, never tell them cold founding fathers where we buried nightmares and hyena bones in the cassava garden, and how I live up to the absurd. The herdsman and his gifts everywhere in my country of birth. You said a hunter is black. I would not tell them this story, late from prayers, but you said I have Suratul Balad and Suratul Fatiha. I'm amazed to discover Officer X is in my nightmare, but in this awful nightmares, I reimagine my blackness, my slaveness, decolonizing Officer X. working in the farm, housekeepers, papers given, the Italian way, oozing for the cold weather, alcohol clots, the devil in my hospital bed, the Pope came for slave reason. I'm amazed to discover that you have gone and Jesus came, but that from the cassava garden, from the exact spot of the burial in the cassava garden, I could hear words you whispered. I could hear you praise the Lord, the prayers you ask Jesus, the prayer you ask Allah, the prayers you ask Jesus, adieu. Now I'll read the penultimate poem in Ghost Letters. It's a sonnet. It's called Enshrine. When I die in the streets of America, my traumatized skin must be endorsed like a master's allegiance. For whipping me, knock, knock, who's there? Milkman. Milkman is not more African than I spare you from death. Of the Senegalese slave howling, a hunting sab is better than a bamboo flute crying to ghosts from the Nile. One kind of myth, fistful of mud, Kankurang musk. Ah, my father's broken promise and his wish for ruin results. In my immaculate kaftan, ghost mother gives me fresh milk. It was August, circumcised beside the river, burning heat I treasure. Oh, I declare possibly being the outsider is safer. J'ai l'impression de déraciner le faucon, drunk from palm oil. I would want to see dry blood in my gaping wounds, burns and burn. Cuts caused by his tongue master in the middle. La crise des langues. Le vautour dévorant son ombre, l'aigle royal, drunk from Bisabs. Bush Boy shrine contained sacred relics when it broke. Shompole, how are we doing time-wise? Okay. We're good?
Yes, we're doing good.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay, so I'll read one more.
yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, I'll read a short one. So I thought because of the theme of today, I'll read something called Multinational Self, this poem. Basically what it does, it's an archival gathering, and I call it Multinational Self because of the different identities I embody. So I'll read this poem and I'll stop there. Thank you again for everything. This poem is called Multinational Self. Imagine shutting myself in the American face where I face the low slung and pale sky to draw everywhere Africanness, begone Negroness, to end the elephant shadow of negritude. Poivron doux et piment dans mes blessures. The will to smile, that big Senegalese smile. Un homme blanc me dépose au regard de l'océan Atlantique, au regard des terres africaines. Because I refuse to stop for prose, because the aches of double exile never froze. My humming lure vultures in jungles for saintly dose. We slowly become French, Senegalese, American in the law of faith, the setting of dream gone dark on bamboo farms. Les secrets de la mer fantôme, du Chouraï pour déloger le mal, du Chouraï pour purifier sa véranda boueuse. Looking back, insanity and nostalgia curve against my people's tongue, dépense dangereux. In defense of multinational self, a penance I pay for coffin maker. Je suis le mendiant béni, je suis le mendiant guéri. It is said I was baptized in the shrine with Compo church was set. Through the rebels' attack, Ghost Mother knew it was safe. Gan bu doxoot bala lek dem rooti deret ak dem dee. Au cœur des vautours, sable, boue, rivière, fleurs, plantes. Mais alors, très bien, je te défie, esprit colonialiste. Je te défie, quitte l'Afrique. Thank you so much. I'll stop there.
Thank you. That was wonderful. I don't know if you have a few words to just add about what you read, and then we'll move on to Su-Yee Lin.
Wait, sorry, I didn't hear that. You said something?
Oh, I said, if you have a few words to add about specifically just why you read this and to us, and then why or how you see it related to folklore, and then we'll move on to Su-Yee.
Sure. I think the last poem, it's sort of, you know, I'm interested in telling stories. I don't like to call myself a poet, right? I like to say that I'm a storyteller, right? I use the archive to tell my own story. So the last poem, you hear Jesus there, you hear the rabbi, you hear the imam, right? So the ghost mother become the sort of like the backbone of the poem, while I embody all these religions, right? You know, so I'm Senegalese, African, you know, my real mother, biological mother who passed away when I was 6 was Catholic. My grandmother is Muslim, so, and my adopted parents are Jewish. So I have all that functioning in the poem, and I'm building my own archive when I deal with poetry, right? You know, but also poetry is a device of survival. So these poems, what they do, they help me hold life together. You know, I was still discovering. I think, you know, writing is one of those things, like you think you know everything, but turns out you don't know everything.
Yep. Yes, I am finding that too.
Does that
I always
help?
think I know.
Yeah.
Yes, it does. Thank you. Yes, and then we will go to Su-Yee's reading.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to say thank you to Shompole for putting this all together. And also, it was really great hearing your reading, Baba. I'm very excited that I get to read and speak alongside you and Rosa. So I'm going to be reading part of a pretty short piece, actually, a story that was recently published in Quarterly West, called Some Humanity Still. Okay, let me pull this up. In Wyoming, the boyfriend dresses like a wolf. I say to him, if you are a predator, better yet to choose a mountain lion or to clothe yourself in your own skin. No one knows wolves here anymore, except as something to be shot. The boyfriend knows all this, but doesn't care. He runs around the pastures, and the cattle scatter like leaves. The head of a wolf is long and pointed, teeth peeking through gray lips. His eyes are yellow, his coat dappled gray and white. I read of how wolves are important to ecosystems 2 states over, cause trophic cascades when removed, but in Wyoming, a woman tells me that introducing wolves to Yellowstone was the biggest mistake they made. The boyfriend is not so smart, but neither is he dumb. He dresses as a wolf to irritate, to antagonize, and if he is shot, so be it. That's exactly what he wants, to prove something to somebody. He's like the magpie pulling the eagle's tail, pulling and pulling, trying to make something happen. The boyfriend and I haven't been on the best of terms. If he is a wolf, I am a bobcat. He's showy, aggressive. I'm sneaky and cautious. We respect one another, but we just can't seem to get along. But he's the one who was here first, raised here before he met me. Our spaces overlap. He will take the sheets from the bed, and I will steal his pillow in retaliation. In our waking lives, he sits on his side of the house and I sit in mine. We rarely speak. This isn't the way it's always been. We used to cozy up by the fireplace, place our feet in each other's laps, watch the snow falling outside as we shared a blanket on the couch. But things have changed. Maybe it's a time that has passed by, each of us yearning for something different. Maybe it's something innate in his personality or in mine. I find myself skittish around him. He shuts himself off, drives far away for hours, sometimes all night. Our freezer is filled with roadkill: porcupine, rabbit, raccoon, once a doe. He will eat the meat barely singed, almost raw. When the boyfriend put on the wolf costume, I thought, aha, so that's who he is, like a light bulb finally turning on. Now that he is a wolf, he stays away even longer. I occasionally catch glimpses of him when I drive on the gravel-covered county road, past the pastures of our neighbors. I have warned them that he is the boyfriend, not a true wolf, although he scares the black Angus cattle the same way a wolf does. I tell them he means no harm. He's just having a crisis of the spirit. They nod, but I don't know how long their patience will last. Plus, I'm the different one. I'm the one they don't trust. When he returns, his hands and feet are bloody, the nails filled with the dry dirt of these hills. Ticks nestle in his hair and on his pelt. He eschews any help, but the sigh he makes as he enters the tub makes me think there's some humanity in him still. I've seen this happen before, a neighbor tells me. Gotta do something before things go too far. He gives me side eye, but I ignore him. It's not my job to fix the boyfriend. I'm the one who has to live here. Hunting season, though, is drawing near. I'm gonna stop there, but there's a little bit more to the story, but you can read it online. It's free. But what was it? Sorry. So I wrote this piece while I was at a residency in Wyoming after I attended a backpacking retreat in the Cascades out near Seattle, not too far from Pacifica, I think. But at the retreat, we were like discussing all sorts of issues relating to wildlife and ecosystems. And so in this piece of flash fiction, I was really thinking about not only the rumors of animals around where I was staying in Wyoming, but also the role of the outsider versus the insider, like who belongs in the landscape, how one's identity is carved from the places they come from or adopt. And I was also embracing the idea of transformation, of the idea of a trickster that's so common in folklore. So folklore often has to do with place, with creation myths, with explanations of what has happened before and what the rules are of the world and who gets to break them. So I was playing a bit with those ideas. But yeah, thank you to everyone for listening.
Thank you for sharing. So I've read a lot of your speculative work, but I haven't even read this one. So I'm really actually excited to finish this after this panel. But
it's pretty
thank
new.
you. Yeah. And I can see some of the themes that attracted me to your work originally anyway. So I'm excited to read it. But thank you so much for sharing. And then we will go to Rosa, and then after that, I'll do a brief reading, and then we'll all just have kind of an open discussion and have some questions to get us along.
Hello there. So wonderful to read with Baba and Sue and to be invited here by Shompole. I don't want to read, I just want to keep hearing both of you read and to have a conversation. But I will add something because I've been asked to this reading. And I'm going to read the first poem in my other tongue, or other tongue, her tongue, their tongue. The title is meant to be read in various ways, and read the first poem, and then I'm also going to read the penultimate poem. I know, Baba, you read your penultimate poem too. There's something about penultimate poems that do something in a book. And then I'll read something new from a manuscript that I'm working on now. This is called The Story to Be Written. To the archives I have sent your early hours descending this basement stairs, a line of jeans found there frozen overnight, then waiting at the rag shop for a ride that would never come. Your girlhood, your marriage in my rear view, the beginning and the end, and at the machine, the vague answers of what you did between. The pictures could not resolve the stories not told, not mine to tell. Although for the famous poet, I dreamed sign a copy of my book, a painting on a wedding chest, Cassoni, depicting highlights, each curse. This land, angular and strange, we are citizens, our ascension as Icarus, and then our descent. The erased trail of migrants, with our skin we hoped to touch and worship a new belonging. This agave, this aloe vera through which my nephew went tumbling is where I live now, jagged as this poem, but also a poultice for the wounds. Sand blows the metaphor of the border into the mouths of women who walk daily between sovereignties to care for our children, our homes. You came to give your children a cliche, something to get them started. Into breathing, I came fully into my own and can barely kiss you with these wavering words. You cannot anyway make them out, reading glasses or not. The book opens to your distance. The phone rings and rings. Can you reach it amongst things? The nubby orange suit you wore on the ship, cruised by expectations. If leaving isn't my legacy, what is? I wandered off into a desert of foreign species, the mulberry's roots invading our mid-century house. The gypsy with your name in Boston asked me if I wanted a reading. I said I was also there for a reading, and did she want one from me? Once a party girl, I now spend an afternoon touring rare manuscripts and preening for the ceiling. It's carved figures and white endowment, what I want to be housed there, to marry it. It might take the second sinking of the Titanic to allow me entry. The Gutenberg Bible glows beneath a glass case, and a floor above I tremble among the stacks of papers that pierce draft to influence. At dinner in a fine establishment, I make everyone sad talking of you, and the desire for the waiter, Portuguese, becomes a second act. This imminence of grief and the description of fresh hake. Oh, bull in your white apron, I am not tricked out in a cow suit, but in a sweater dress whose neck cowls from the anecdote. My mother, it begins, I found in an archive. She was smiling among the photographs. Tuck me, dear waiter, in layers of wine. The story to be written, or this flight, this flight, this flight from its gravity. Big donor, his fortune in telescoping, says it's really weak. You can loosen its pull with a magnet. We have all in our heads ancestral myths awaiting, even when freely our bodies move away from them. My daughter's first attempts, mama okay, papa okay, and mess. What likely cost incurred as one reads or writes, what is to be read to or by strangers that isn't meant to be bought or sold. Mother, forgive me for wanting you to remain familiar as I flirt with the waiter, and for my excursions, a daughter whose arranged marriage is not with Spanish. In the picture next to the others, I am the shortest. No one knows to pluck tenderly from the folds of your linen closet the original sheets on which nothing was conceived. I say it's an injustice, the wine coming over me, your face and voice splitting me from there. I walk to the store when they are not looking, a dream that swings its legs off the bed. A friend with no deeds to these lands said he worked when others wrote, for his mother, her jewels stolen, a citizenship fraught in these acts, when in the writing of them we enter law, we strike our names, the X in the dark field drawing us through blue lights, signs to land us, others to exit. By twos, we enter the story and leave the arc built to survive the telling of catastrophes, one by one. That poem's longer than I remember. I kept turning pages and I'm like, why is this poem so long? So I think I'm just going to read the penultimate rather the other instead of an additional poem. So I think that'll be about right. This is called Voice, an essay. So more ghosts here. I'm adding to the, it makes sense that in this conversation, there's a lot of ghosts and archives. Voice, an essay. I believe in voice as I do in ghosts. Even Freud saw the ghost of a dead patient in his office. There is a grain of truth concealed in every delusion. When my friend died, his parents detected in the sudden clinking of the chandelier his presence, as if unexpectedly he had returned from college to ask, "What's for dinner?" And they laughed for the first time in days. A voice is all that can cut through it. Soon after, his bereaved girlfriend slept with his brother, easily mistaken as his twin. Did they make love as a way to speak to him through each other? They were right who invade against the voice, too sexual an organ. Sometimes at night, a voice rises from a set of actions deep inside. This wooing of another voice, a voice we cannot help listening to. And in Spanish pleads with someone who can't hear me. It is as if I have multiple mouths and ears inside and outside of the dream. I have also many lovers and attics crowded with costumes, and my father is alive, walking backwards over a railing. Jeff breaks the spell, calling me back into the present in English. He shakes my arm and the voice retreats. A phantom can thus be sensitive to idiom. I try to run toward my father or close the hatch behind a lover or simply fall back asleep. I do not sublimate in the same way in Chinese or in French. Freud relates the story of the apparition in third person, revealing only later that he himself had witnessed the ghost. Then that the figure was not a ghost, but a dead patient's sister, also afflicted with Graves' disease. The voice in the dream visits again and again and is mistaken as the same. Why does it appear? To understand a shared affliction, to take the place of the dead or air its concerns. I bet the sister came to settle the doctor's bill. My grandmother slept with the lights on, her long gray locks tightly wound, worried her dead husband would return to fulfill his final threat. If you're not good to me, I'll come in the night and drag you out of bed by your hair. The ghost of my grandfather, night after night, not as diaphanous figure, serial and bellowing, but as aerial and bellowing, but as a voice that could conduct in his wife's mind a terrifying rehearsal. Fareed and I talk not of ghosts, but of family stories that possess us and traffic bodies through our poems. Mientras más violenta es la historia, menos hablan de los personajes de sí, consigo, con otros, es un ritmo irrespirable. I believe in poems as I do haunted houses. We say, someone must have died here. There is a patched wall where the bullet exited the head. We make sense of noises, this one being a noisy ghost by some fuzzy tale the neighbors tell in pieces, a tiny bit of an absent narrative. We ask questions into abandoned rooms, the answers not apparent until we play back what we've taped on our sensitive recorders and listen agape to voices rising in waves and peaks, or we try to conjure them by moving our fingers back and forth over letters that spell out exactly what we didn't expect but take as true, or they keep telling us no, no, no in jerky movements of our wrists. Voices like ghosts always win. They can walk through walls or move furniture. And I wanted to tell you the voices that are woven into this poem. And so beginning with the first is from Jacques Derrida's Archive Fever, and then the next one is Alice Notley from her essay Voice, and then the other one is from Voiceless by David Shapiro, and then from Nathaniel Mackey's Cante Moro, and a Barbara Guest essay, and a Julia Kristeva's The Impudence of Uttering the Mother Tongue, from Valerie Mecher's poem, and then finally Michel de Certeau's Vocal Utopias. So those, every time I do like this, that's somebody's voice that I'm quoting. That's it, thank you.
Thank you. Wow, that is fantastic. I really, and this is something I'm still trying to explore, but I found your poems actually through the Minotaur and the Bull Figure, which appears through a lot of your poems that I've read, and also often in this collection of poetry. So I'm just really interested in that, and I have a couple of questions for you after. But as of right now, I will read 4 poems for you guys, and then we'll open it up for discussions. And I already see a couple of questions coming into the Q&A. So here goes. And this is one of my very, very new poems, like written in the last maybe 4 or 5 weeks. Woman last seen snarling, sternum unhinged, a rainstorm clenched between her teeth. Woman last seen floating in the belly of the Niagara, bloated and bereft of mercy. Woman last seen ablaze, splintering in the unexpected heat of an immolation. Woman last seen feral, anguish propelling her into flight. This is a record of her undoing. Woman last seen with rapids unfurling in her throat. Sometimes the roar ruptures the quiet indigo of morning. And this is a little bit of an older poem. I was working on this particular series through my MFA. This one is titled Birdwatcher Rescues a Flamingo in Texas. He tells it the same way every time, how he found her snared in a trap in the heart of the Texan wilderness. Her eyes were coal black, midnight black, soot black and feral, the air around her thick with the scent of fear and loneliness. He heard her long before he saw her, voice piercing the edge of twilight, beckoning him into the unforgiving Texan range. Her whole body shuddered with cold and panic, pulse ricocheting against the column of her throat, eyes wild, eyes always wild. And this one is in the same series of poems, and it is titled The Birdwatcher's Wife Learns How to Speak. And this is poem number 2 in that series. The woman is rendered mute, robbed of speech at landfall. She is all right most of the time, but every so often the silences stretch on for weeks, frost reaching beyond winter's threshold and into spring. The woman has a birdsong trapped in her throat. At the bank, the teller speaks to her as if she's stupid. She bristles, biting her tongue. Later that night, she and the birdwatcher watch television side by side, 2 bodies bathed in blue light. His body next to hers radiating heat. She glances at the window when he laughs and reminds herself that the neighbor's hound is locked away for the night. And this one is still untitled. It's also very new, and it is playing with this space of folklore in our poetry. The morning phrase, violet sky unraveling. A woman is found mummified in the house of the lotus eater, sarcophagus still littered with lotus leaves. her iridescent feathers tinged with a bitter blue scent of apathy. Here, night collapses into dawn. So I want to go a little bit into these poems and why I put this panel together. So I've always really, really loved folklore, and I grew up with my mother's stories, and still, I wouldn't even say grew up. My mom still tells me stories when I ask her, like folkloric stories from my tribe, specifically the Maasai tribe from Kenya. And I can call her on any day and ask her to remind me of this story she told me when I was young, and she'll do it without missing a beat. So there's something about those stories that have always really captivated me. But I also, alongside her stories, I also grew up with like Cinderella and then Greek mythology. So I've always kind of moved between spaces of folklore and mythology, like across cultures, even before we migrated to the US. So in my own tales and my own poetry, I'm always trying to work between these idea of these stories that are passed on and these figures who are usually named the woman, the princess, the prince, the hero, the god, whoever, but then also trying to find that space where that figure is more real. And that's really what I'm working on with my own poetry, like moving between this like larger story that is passed down versus that more personal, like where these people actually become individuals or these figures become individuals. So when I was putting this panel together, I read all of these writers' works, and I found that each of them were working with this idea of like maybe the larger folklore and mythology, but also like more personal or more individual tales and how they fit into this carried on story that is then passed down. And what I find fascinating is that folklore in general allows almost anyone to step into that story and find themselves in it. They don't have to find all of themselves in a story, but they usually find parts of them in it that allows them to connect with it. And when I'm reading a lot of writers' works, I usually find those bits and pieces, and that's what I'm usually connecting to. So that is why I pulled these people together here to talk about that. We'll start off with like 2 questions I already see in the Q&A, and then I have a couple of my own questions that I'll direct to everyone, and we'll just go from there. So I have one question from Laura Rosenthal. Oh, this is more of a comment, but to any or all of the readers in working with folklore in your own writing, to what extent do you engage with, dialogue with, or retell original stories and texts? And to what extent do you take inspiration from them and then jump up from there? And this is open to either of you guys or all of you guys. Anyone want to jump in? Or should I? I can jump in and just start with my own experience. So to what extent do I engage with, and then to what extent do I take inspiration from? So it depends on what I'm writing. With these poems specifically, the original idea came from the original idea of a person or a being that can shift from bird to person came from a story my mom used to tell me when I was growing up, in which a girl is married off to a crow, but nobody except her can see that that's a crow. And she was scared, and she was trying to like figure out, she was trying to evade this marriage because this is a crow that she was married to, and she was scared because she didn't know what that is. And she was also scared, she was going to a new land, and nobody could see the more quote unquote unhuman, inhuman, or maybe monstrous elements of her groom. So that is a story that kind of started off this idea of like figures that could be bird or human. And then from that, it grew and sort of left that original tale, because I don't even think any of that tale is in any of my poetry today. But that idea of that figure grew into something else, where I started seeing and relating that to just the experience of migrating, and then the experience of what is it like to be maybe a bird in a human land or a human in a bird land. Like, what are those issues? What would you have to do? How do you fit in? And you can see that in some of my poems that deal with migration and assimilation, in that sense that what is it like on a day-to-day basis, not just this big event, like if it was the marriage, but like going to the bank or going to the grocery store, or how do you find the right language? And I've been in situations where, and I've always spoken English since I was a kid. I grew up bilingual almost from the start. So I spoke English and Swahili and then a little bit of my other languages. But still, I'll get into situations where I'll forget the English word for something, either because I'm startled or it's too sudden, or I'm just caught in my own thoughts and it takes me a minute to just like jump into the right language. So some of that shows up in my poetry in the sense that, like that poem where she's at the bank and the teller speaks to her like she's stupid. In that moment, it takes you to pull your thought, like the world around you is kind of making an assessment of who you are. So those all jump from that idea of like, what is it to be something in a world where everything else is different from you?
I wanted to jump in because it's really fascinating hearing you say all that, Shompole, since I'm like, oh, one of my recent stories has very similar themes. But I think that's
Yes.
sort of what speaks to like folklore and fairy tales and stuff, is that there's a lot that's very universal about it, right? Like these themes are very universal. It's all about transformation. It's about belonging and identity. And that's like what like I'm tackling as a writer too, especially for people who are of different cultures, right? Of like who are third world kids or whatever. But in terms of, yeah, the question of what extent do we engage with or retell, I think originally, like I did start, like I love fairy tale retellings, especially when I was younger. And it's always fun to just see like different points of view of the same story. And so I think that sort of started me writing in a lot of ways. But at this point, a lot of the themes and the framework of storytelling and from folklore is sort of ingrained in my writing. So it's not necessarily like I'm thinking of specific fairy tales or folk tales, or that I'm even thinking about it when I start writing, but it's like forms of foundation.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Go ahead. Go.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I don't know. I think the concern in the work is belonging, timeless. I don't know, the fable, oral history. How do you retrieve identity when you are out of place, right? And I think exile, for me, the way to negotiate the idea of exile or being an outsider is by returning to your, I don't know, to the original site of your birth. Right? So for me, I think most of the time, the work happens with intuition. I mean, I have poems to, just come out of me when I'm walking outside, or when I'm just taking, doing the dishes, or I don't know, or cooking, and so for me the poem comes and I allow it to come, right? And I love, the idea of writer's block is scary sometimes, but I love being able to sometimes just being stuck, because this is when I turn back to my culture, right? I think about the stories that were told. I was not read to as a toddler. I was told stories. So that's where the poetry comes from. So the spine of the work, I think most of the time, my archive is the stories that my grandmother told me when I was a toddler.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about what everyone has said, and it really does resonate for me. And I was thinking, I do in my other tongue, I have a poem that was a response to a painting of Pacific breastfeeding the Minotaur. And when I started writing my other tongue. I had, just given birth. I mean, the poem took a while to manifest, but some of the early poems I was, taking care of a newborn and breastfeeding and thinking about the implications of what it means to pass on or not pass on one's mother tongue, and how that in some ways can feel like passing on a part of your body, but then what happens when you can't, right? I mean, just the mother tongue suggests that there's a connection, a physical connection between the mother and the child, and I mean, that poem was, I think, necessary in the book because there is a way in which all of the poems continue in this vein that I think is very familiar to, in particular, children of immigrants, is that you're constantly both feel pressured to carry on the story, like something was lost. Whatever was lost, you have to maintain it. But then there's a lot of silence around what's been lost too, or the trauma of that losing. So you're trying to recreate it. And what Baba said about the I'm building my own archive, right? But you're also building it with these pieces of the archive that is lost, right? It's even the archive that's not there is part of the archive. And it's also a form of survival. You're sort of building this arc. And I was reminded of, especially when Su-Yee was speaking about, fables and the rewriting of fables. And this is that Anna Maria Hong's book. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but I really love her work. She's a dear friend of mine, and I just really admire her. She writes a lot about fables. She rewrites fables, and she rewrites myths. And she has a book called Fablesque. And Fablesque begins with a poem that is very different from the rest of the poems, in which the speaker talks about this sort of the self-mythologizing of the father. The father always wanted to remind them how clever he was to have escaped from North Korea to South Korea, right? This was so central to his identity that he had to make it the central myth of the family. I'm so clever that the only reason we're here is because I was able to trick an officer and give them a lie and escape being executed like my friends. So you're transmitting the myth, but the trauma through that myth. But it's the poet, right? It's Anna Maria Hong, or the child of that immigrant that is trying to not just transmit the myth, the self-mythologized part, but the part that in some ways the parents are trying to leave out, which is like, in order to tell this story about ourselves, we had to have gone through a certain kind of violence, a certain kind of terror, right? But we tell the story of survival, sometimes leaving out what was necessary for that survival. And I think as poets, we're constantly digging in and saying, yeah, okay, so we've, our family has struggled, and maybe we've overcome some things, but why do I feel so haunted all the time? So that's all I'll say.
First off, I've not heard of Fablesque, but I will be looking it up. It sounds like something I would love to read. And I do agree with you, with all of you guys, on this idea that part of this retelling is creating our own story and telling our own story, but it's also fitting it into what we know comes before and what we either think or hope will come after. Like, there's this idea, at least from my own writing, where I feel like a part of me trying to write about these things specifically is because I think maybe, well, first off, there are things I was looking for in a lot of writing, and I found parts of it, but I didn't find exactly what I was looking for. So part of that work for me is writing what I was looking for. but also writing with the idea or the feeling that if I was looking for it, somebody in the future will look for it. And maybe there's a little bit of value in that and passing that on, and maybe wishing or hoping or just wanting to put that there. So if someone is looking for it the same way I was looking for it, then they at least have a chance of finding it. So with that, I want to ask, and I know you guys have touched a little bit on this, but all of you deal with like these figures, this mythological figures. So the ghost, the wolf, hyenas, and vultures. And I want to ask, at what point, like, because to me, when I read these figures, I almost see them as a shorthand for something like an idea. And I want to know or ask, how much do you guys tap into these figures as shorthands, and how conscious are you of that? And then how do you utilize that? For instance, when I came to Rosa's work, I came through the Minotaur. I wasn't necessarily looking for Minotaur work, but it was this figure in your work that like kind of rang out as something familiar. And then I jumped into more of your work and then found more. And I had a little bit of the same experience with Su-Yee's work as well, where I was just reading, like I was reading speculative fiction. And for her, one of the stories was like, the first stories I read from her was this story, 13 Steps into the Underworld, or In the Underworld. But it touched on all these mythologies of the underworld that I was sort of familiar with. Some of them were Western, some were not. And so that was kind of like a doorway into that world as well, and into your story. And then I had the same thing with Baba, and like, and for you, especially as an African, I always see like wolves and coyotes in a lot of work, but I don't always see like hyenas or vultures and stuff like that. So that was exciting for me for a whole different reason, because I could see how these can correlate, like a hyena, wolf, or vultures can correlate to the wolves and coyotes. So I want to ask how much of that you're working with as a shorthand of these figures, and then how much of your own thing are you adding into it? Who wants to go first?
I'll get the ball rolling. I mean, it's been a long while since I wrote the Minotaur poem, and I feel a great distance from that feeling at the time of, I mean, I really enjoyed, breastfeeding my child. It was, quite a joy of my life to do that in that time spent. But, at that time, I was looking for ways to connect my experience to literary representations, artistic representations of this relationship of the mother's body to the child's body. So even though I was writing about the Minotaur, I was trying to understand that how is the experience, how are certain perspectives left out of these representations that we see, either mythological figures. And this poem, I think, covers that in some sense, where some of the paintings of Pasiphae are really focused on the kind of lascivious aspect of the fact that, she has sex with a bull, right? So, the different drawings or paintings, that's the focus, right? But for me, when I saw the painting of Pasiphae breastfeeding the Minotaur, which isn't a painting by a woman, but that seemed something that I was yearning for, that there was this other way of thinking about the Minotaur as kind of like this baby, that depended on mother's milk. But the mother also looks slightly annoyed in the painting. So that was interesting to me too, that what I was seeing was also this kind of struggle between bodies, the needs, the opposing needs and desires of two bodies that are dependent on each other. And then, you know, there's of course the Minotaur is slayed at the end. You know, he's killed, and there is no discussion. There's not, you know, there's no. It's not part of the myth to talk about how did Pasiphae feel about her son being murdered. You know, as mixed as her feelings were about having, you know, giving birth to a Minotaur, and how she was tricked, you know, by in many ways sort of made this pawn that, you know, that ended up for her being, you know, having, you know, sex with the bull and then having the Minotaur, that how could she not grieve her son in that way, right? So that my perspective had changed as a mother, and I had to see things in a new way, and yet I felt that those perspectives overall were very absent from what I was looking at and reading. So yeah, so that's what I will say about that.
Thank you. And for me, that was because that's a figure I could recognize. That's how I got into your work and then started reading other things and more things in your collection and all that. But I do think that it's so interesting how even when we recognize a figure, when we look at it, we're also looking at it in terms of ourselves, or like from our own perspective, in the sense that you're saying you saw something that was not portrayed and you felt like you wanted or could portray that. And I think that's one of the great things about like using these figures, these mythological figures that we all sort of take for granted, is that everyone is mostly familiar with them, but it also gives us room for saying it or telling that story in your own way based on what you've gone through.
I suppose this is a confession. So the vultures in my work are real. So I grew up not in Senegal. I'm from the South. So my grandmother had a very poetic house. So we lived not far from the cemetery, 2 blocks south, 2 blocks north, or 4 blocks. There's a slaughterhouse, and then 5 blocks east, there's the prostitute house. So I grew up in that kind of surrounding and setting, and the vultures I used to be afraid of, right? So because we used to play soccer not far from the slaughterhouse, and then after all that, you know, so every Friday there's tons of them. So, you know, we used to, now when I go to Senegal, actually, it's almost like a pilgrimage. I go to this place and just sit there and take notes. So I use them as metaphor for return, right? The vultures and the hyenas also. When I was a kid, my grandmother would tell me the story of the hyena feeder. And I became obsessed with that person, that character. So I use it as a metaphor. So it's the milkman and the coffin maker. Yeah, I'll stop there and give Stu a sense.
Thank you.
Yeah, in thinking about your question, I guess I was thinking about how like the story that you referenced, 13 Steps in the Underworld, it does use a lot of mythological or fairy tale characters and sort of ideas from Greek mythology as well. And I think earlier on, like, I did use these figures as more like these ideas as metaphors, or as like secret little hints of knowledge, right? I don't know if other people have read, like, I love Kelly Link's collections, and her earlier collections definitely had a lot of these like little tidbits hidden in the stories that if you knew your fairy tales well, you could catch them and you get that like added little bonus of knowledge in the story. And so I like that idea of just being like, okay, you don't need to know this to understand the story, but this is just like a little bonus. But my more recent work, actually, I would say that I think the animals and things like birds and wolves, like I do know the symbolism, but that's not what comes in first.
Mhm.
So that's also like an extra that gets added in. That's an extra layer that people can get, but it is also very literal sometimes where I'm just like, yeah, I'm just obsessed with birds. Like that's normal, right?
Yeah. So Easter eggs of a
Obviously you're
sort.
obsessed with birds too.
Yes. I'm currently obsessed with birds. I have been for a few years. Um, so we have another question, and this is from Ronnie Bolpla. So this is to Baba. When you code switch languages, how do you merge and fuse your words? For example, do you choose rhyme? Do you look for assonance? Are you translating in your poems? Are there words that have no translation? And she says, thank you.
Oof, that sounds like a dissertation question. You can write a whole book about that question. No, what I said earlier, I think the poem becomes a safe space, right? I think when I sit down to write, I think when you think about rhyme and assonance and all those devices we learn from poetry school or the workshop, when you walk into I don't know, when you walk into a poetry class, I used to have students who were afraid of taking my classes because they think, oh, we have to memorize things, we have to learn how rhyme works, we have to learn how scansion works. And I think I try to step away from that idea of the Western way of looking at poetry. Poetry for me, it's survival, it's healing. I don't write poetry because it's cool or it's hip or you're supposed to know all these definitions. They are important, but for me, I'm trying to negotiate a lot. That's way deeper than me, and that's what the poetry does. So when I sit down to write, I just follow my intuition. Wherever kind of volcanic intuition that comes to mind, I go with it. And the lines, I mean, I think I'm against a univocal poem or univocal voice, right? I want the poem to do so many things. I want the poems to be universal. I want the poems to be, to be accessible to kids from Senegal, I don't know, from Chile, I don't know, from France, from America. That's the kind of poetry I'm interested in. So I don't think about rhyme, or I just sit down and start writing, and I'm always interested in process. What happens later, right? Yeah, I don't know whether that helped, but that's all I got.
I mean, a little bit more of a question, and this is something I'm struggling with my own writing, is how much do you expect, or do you just, when you're using a different language in your writing, and this goes to Rosa as well, it's that how much do you worry, maybe is the better word, about whether or not the language or like what you're saying makes sense without translating it? Because that's something I come up with. I always get to a point where I'm like, okay, do I need to write this in English? And if I do, versus how I first thought about it, because sometimes I don't always think necessarily first in English. But when it comes to my writing, I find like I'm always trying to like navigate that space. So can either of you guys kind of speak a little bit on that? How much you worry about it? How much is just, if you really want to know, you'll look for it? Because sometimes I also like that. And I think Su-Yee was saying something about like, if you know something, or like that idea of like an Easter egg or like this surprise hidden meaning in the writing, which I also think is so rewarding as a reader. But yes, that is the question.
Well, I mean, I teach in a bilingual MFA program, and it's Spanish and English. And, some of our students are bilingual, some of them are monolingual Spanish, English. It's simply that as a whole, we have students in our class who write in one or the other language, sometimes in both. And this just came up right before, I was going to say coming here, before zooming in. I was at one of our student readings, and there's one of our students is from the Catalan Pyrenees, and she writes in this way that feels very much like out of the Chicano tradition of code switching. But she sort of arrived at this form because she left where she's from and went to Scotland, and then she did her master's in East Anglia. And so for her, like, you know, you said, Baba, it was a form of survival that she felt like she had to write in English because she was in a program where everyone spoke English, but it felt so limiting to her as someone who, even before she left her country, spoke two languages, right? Spoke Catalan and Spanish, and then, you know, from Scotland to England. And so she found this form of mixing languages. And I'm fascinated by that, because even though I grew up speaking Spanish at home, my parents actually never learned English. So, you know, and I grew up in a neighborhood where there were immigrants of many different places, and there was also a large African American community. That there were so many ways of speaking outside of the classroom, and yet I have, you know, that my inner sensor is very well developed by years of being in the educational system, which is that poetry, which in some ways became part of my educational journey, even though it isn't, I wouldn't say that it's circumscribed by, you know, academia. It's something that comes from me. But I sort of, for a long time, associated it with the thing that I do is the thing that I do in English, because I was formally, right, educated in English. And yet Spanish creeps in, like Spanish won't be left out of the, you know, and for a long time, I used to call it the ghost language, right? We were talking about ghosts, and in fact, my MFA thesis, which I never published, was called, was it called Ghost Language or Ghost Languages? For a while, it was called In Translation. But the point is that my poems in English always felt like under the surface. They're like, maybe not anyone, no one else can notice it. It just sounded like regular English. But for me, it was there. It was being informed by this other language. As I've gotten older, the book that I'm working on now has a lot more Spanish in a very kind of, you know, the way that I speak, in which Spanish creeps in which I code switch. And I've allowed myself to do that. Do I feel like I need to explain? Well, no. What example would I be setting for my bilingual MFA students if I felt like I need to explain? And you know, there's an Argentinian theorist, Walter Mignolo, who was one of the first who I read when I was doing my PhD, who said, why are we italicizing the word that's considered foreign? Like, let's stop italicizing. And I was like, you're right. Like, why? So I stopped doing that too. And that was very liberating. And I figure when the reader, look, Google's great. If the reader comes to something and they don't understand it, they can Google it. And I didn't need to understand necessarily. I would like to actually know all the languages in Baba's poems. It's not that I just want to be blissfully ignorant and just enjoy the music. I don't like being ignorant about languages in any way. I want to know, and if I had the text, I would try to learn what the words. But in him reading those poems to me, I didn't feel that in some ways it was keeping me out, like it was, you know, not accepting me and it was pushing me out. It was there, it was an invitation if I was willing to take it. But why should it make extra room for me by explaining, you know? Mm-hmm. And I feel sort of the same way about when I use Spanish in my work. It's just, there's a reason why it's there, and I don't need to make excuses for it, you know?
Baba. I mean, I was just jotting down some notes where it's just like allowing that idea of allowing the language or your writing to take the space it needs to. But what about you?
No, I totally I totally agree with Professor Alcalá. I think, you know, the multilingual poem did not feel safe to access the workshop. I did not take poem that has Wolof or in French or Jola or Manding in the workshop because, and even those poems that contain the milkman and the coffin maker, I always felt like, you know, it'll hijack the moment of the poem or even the time of the workshop because people would probably, you know, I'm grateful for everything, right? And this comes from a very good place when I share this. But I just felt like people would keep asking questions about those characters or want me to translate the language instead of just getting the gist of the poem. What is, you know, saying something like, oh, this is really interesting. I don't know what's happening here, but you should push this. But people would instead focus on the language and on his characters. And I think for me, I'm trying to create devices for survival with the poetry, but I'm also trying to create a poetics of resistance, right? For me, the poem needs to hold something that I embody. I feel that if I write a poem in complete English, it's not a universal poem. I'm in fact, you know, giving voice to English, you know, to the English language, and I'm trying to push against it. I want to be able to show that, you know, the poem can stand as a universal structure, right? You know, it can do so many things. Imagine, you know, think about the white page as something at your power, and you can do whatever you want with it. Right? I hope that helps.
That helps. It is also a little bit scary to just imagine that you can do whatever you want. So you guys, if you have any questions, you can pop them into the chat or the Q&A. So all three writers also deal a little bit with like geography and cultural memory and cultural erosion. So I'd just like you guys to speak a little bit about how that shapes your work. And then not just in the past, but also going forward.
Okay, the dreaded silence. I'm gonna jump in. Silence makes me itchy. So the question is about cultural erosion or the breakdown and the transmission of cultural folklore. I mean, what's interesting to me is well, there's a few things, and I think we can think of it as cultural erosion or breakdown. The first is that, you know, returning, and this, you know, it's just kind of one of my obsessions and fascinations, is just the experience of the children of immigrants, because that's my personal experience. That the place that you think you're from because it's the place where your parents were from is frozen in time. That place doesn't exist anymore. So those of us who return, we find everybody has kind of moved on, right? That place is not the same. Even the language has changed, right? There are new foods, right? There are different ways of speaking. And yet there is, I think, sometimes a desperate attempt to maintain that past. And then it's enforced, right? It's enforced by the parents, right? That the children must kind of accept this version of who they are and where they're from. And you know, my father did not allow English into the home. I'm grateful for that now, but it didn't come necessarily out of wanting to broaden our horizons, but out of fear. Out of fear of what was going to be lost. And he would get very agitated if he heard my brothers and I speak English. So, you know, even though, and I said earlier about sort of being, you know, being educated in English and feeling like for a long time, I felt like my poems were the space, that the only thing that could exist in my poems was English, right? That I sort of made that connection between the two. But both English and poetry were a refuge, were a possibility of building a new story and taking what I wanted from that, right? Not feeling like it had to be, you know, sort of shoved down my throat, right? That I had to only recreate the story that I had been given. So, you know, no erosion ecologically, I think, is good. And I'm not someone who specializes in this. Perhaps, Su-Yee, you can speak to that a little bit more. At least you seem to know more than I do in what you've already said. But you know, when things break apart or they fragment, there is a possibility of rebuilding something new out of that. You know, I mean, Glissant talks about this, the horror that you know, colonialism has enacted, but the things also, right? The languages, these new sort of things coming together, they also have to be acknowledged. Not as a positive outcome, simply as what is. And so I think that cultural erosion is part of assimilation, right? Is part of what happens when people are made to assimilate, and the fear of those who think, you know, who worry about what's going to be lost, but something is also shaped out of that. And then the second thing I was thinking is that the erosion comes in that not only as a poet am I telling the story or being told to tell the story of my family or the story of that experience that is partially their story, but I'm telling it in a language they can't read. They can't read. Well, both my parents have passed, but they could never read that. So how does that change the story for the story to be told in another language in which the original figures of that story can't access, right? I mean, there's something to be mourned there for sure, but there's also how can we re-see ourselves if we find another language to say it in, right? And I use language not just literally, but figuratively.
I just wanted to say that I agree 100% with you, Rosa, in that, well, it's strange to call it cultural erosion in a lot of ways because I feel like it's more like change, right? Culture is constantly changing and moving, and even thinking about how, like, my parents were immigrants, how they view, like, I'm Chinese American, I was born in the US, but how they view China and how I view China is very different. And also, my experience is so different from people who grew up in China, right? So it's like our cultures are very different in general, even just being Chinese American versus being Chinese. Um, so it is hard, it's like hard to separate culture and geography in general, because I guess I was thinking about how, like, my work deals a lot with kind of how geography influences identity and culture, and how that is, like, it's interconnected. There's no way to separate those things, because even think about, um, like, it's just about context and memory in a lot of ways, which I also reference a lot in my work, because I was just, I was thinking about how, like, people with memory loss, it's like they are different people. Their identities have changed because they no longer are able to access these past experiences that they've had. So yeah, and thinking about even just the types of environments that people are from actually change their ways of thinking, like the way you access language and what sorts of language you have actually changes the way you think and the way you communicate. Because if you don't have language, you cannot communicate in certain ways, right? I don't know if that answered the question.
It does, it does. And even as I was writing the question about cultural erosion, I was actually playing with the word cultural evolution, but I still felt like, at least for my own writing, I'm always in a place where I'm trying to decide, do I not write about it because I forgot or because I found something better? But I think all of what both of you guys have said really does touch on that question.
So I like your point of culture and geography linking together, because we can't separate those two. And you know, for me, that move always takes me to the archive, how culture is defined through the archive, how geography is defined through the archive. Think of Africa, right? Think of the US, think of France, right? And I think what that does for me, reading culture throughout the archive, is really interesting, because time was defined by us. And you know, when you look at Black culture, you know, any culture, you know, um, time is completely, you know, the narrative of culture, the narrative of geography, it's all, you know, it's very ambiguous and blurred. And our job, I think, as artists, and poets especially, and any kind of writer, right, revisiting those stories and those memories to allow for conversation or building a language for the future generation. I think it's really, that's the gist of the work, I think. Our job is to retell those stories and tell it in a very good, deep, honest way.
Thank you. Just thinking about all you guys' responses. And I don't think there is one answer. I think it is how we approach it that kind of shapes what we're writing and why we're writing. Because when I think about like that link between culture, geography, memory, and then going back to places where you think or you have them so starkly in your memory, and then you go back and everything is different. And that sometimes does not really have to do even with migration, but it could just be like time, where I know I have places where I visited as a child and I felt like everything was massive, and then I go back as an adult and I'm like, wait, it's not as big as I thought it was. It's not as intimidating or as scary. as I remember it to be. So I do think that time plays a little bit of that, like part of that magic, and like encoding it in your memory, and also how you transmit it forward. And I think what about poetry and stories, like the amazing thing about it is that it captures that feeling, not necessarily how that place is, but just your experience of that feeling. And then that is the magic that gets transmitted forward. Any other questions? I think we're gone way into our time, and I know a couple of us have to leave. So any other questions, throw it in the chat, or you could just ask them out loud. I think we can figure out a way to get your questions out here. And then if not, let me know and we can end the panel for the night. All right. I don't think there's any other questions. So I will say thank you, Rosa, Su-Yee, Baba. Thank you very, very much for joining me on this discussion. It was eye-opening for me. I hope it was eye-opening for everyone else. Thank you, Matem and Kal, and then everyone for joining us. I really enjoyed this panel. Please look into everyone's writing, they're really amazing writers. So go look up their writing, and they do very different things, but all captivating. And then I'll be hosting another panel later in a couple of weeks, I think maybe around June. So look out for that. And that is it for tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. It was
This is
wonderful
great.
to be here. Bye.
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 Thank you, guys.
Thank you. It's wonderful to listen to
Thank
all
you.
of
I know
Thanks,
that went,
Shompole.
yeah, it went over longer than I expected, but I'm really happy with how it went. Thank you.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Gonna stop recording.